On the surface, this was a $1 million 18th birthday party for a rising star. In reality, it was a human auction. While the cameras captured a princess, her mother was finalizing a transaction. Ada Choi is not being celebrated. She is being sold to a billionaire as collateral for a gambling debt. This is the true story behind Hong Kong's most disturbing family scandal. Ada was born in 1973 into a Hong Kong that was a chaotic collision of desperate poverty and rapid industrial growth. It was a city of cage homes and plastic flower factories, where survival was a daily contact sport. Her family was fractured early on. Her parents divorced when she was still a small child, leaving Ada and her two older brothers in the sole custody of their mother. This separation was the first crack in the foundation, the moment where stability vanished from Ada's life. Madame Tong hadn't started out as a monster. She was simply a woman consumed by the specific virulent pathology of the gambler. In the cramped public housing estates of Hong Kong, gambling was often seen as a harmless pastime, a social lubricant. But for Madame Tong, it was oxygen. It began with small stakes, mahjong games with neighbors, the occasional bet on the horses at the Happy Valley racecourse. But the psychology of a gambling addict is a spiral. When she won, she felt invincible, convinced that she had cracked the code of destiny. When she lost, she felt a desperate, clawing need to chase the loss, convinced that the next hand would fix everything. Ada's childhood was defined by this cycle. She did not grow up with bedtime stories. She grew up with the sound of her mother bargaining with creditors. While other children were worrying about homework, Ada was worrying about eviction. The family was nomadic, not by choice, but by necessity. They moved constantly, flitting from one rundown apartment to another, always one step ahead of the Dai Yi Lung, the loan sharks. In this chaotic ecosystem, Ada learned her role early. She was the servant. Because her mother was often absent, either physically at the gambling dens or mentally checked out due to the stress of her debts, the burden of the household fell on Ada's small shoulders. She washed the dishes, she scrubbed the floors, she cooked the meals. She became a little adult before she even hit puberty. There is a specific trauma in being a child who has to parent their own parent. It conditions you to believe that your needs are secondary, that your value lies only in your utility, in how much you can serve others. This psychological conditioning was the soil in which her later tragedy would take root. She was trained to be obedient, to be the fixer, to sacrifice herself for the greater good of the family. The poverty was grinding. There were days when there wasn't enough food, days when the electricity was cut, but the physical deprivation was manageable compared to the psychological terror. The loan sharks of Hong Kong in the 1980s were not subtle. They were brutal enforcers of a shadow economy. Ada grew up with the terrifying rhythm of heavy knocks on the door at midnight. She learned to stay silent, to hide in the back room, holding her breath as men shouted obscenities and kicked at the metal gates. She saw red paint splashed across their front door, a universal symbol in Hong Kong that meant pay up or bleed. For a young girl, this environment breeds a deep-seated insecurity and a desperate desire to please. Ada loved her mother. It is a cruel paradox of abuse that victims often cling tighter to the abuser, hoping that if they are just good enough, the chaos will stop. Madame Tong exploited this. She painted herself as the victim of bad luck, weeping to her children about her misfortunes, manipulating their guilt to extract their sympathy. Ada didn't see a monster. She saw a struggling mother who needed saving. As Ada transitioned from childhood to adolescence, something shifted. The scrawny, overworked girl blossomed. By the age of 15, nature had bestowed upon her a gift that was starkly at odds with her grim surroundings. She grew tall, slender, and strikingly beautiful. Her face had a classical refinement, high cheekbones, large expressive eyes, and a natural elegance that couldn't be dimmed by cheap clothes or exhaustion, Madame Tong noticed. For a gambling addict drowning in debt, assets are everything. The television can be pawned, the jewelry can be sold. But Madame Tong realized she had an asset far more valuable than gold growing right under her roof. She looked at her 15-year-old daughter and stopped seeing a child. She began to see a potential revenue stream. The shift was subtle at first. It started with comments about Ada's looks, suggestions that she should dress better, push herself forward. Then came the modeling contests in 1988. At just 15 years old, Ada was pushed into a supermodel search competition. She didn't win, but that didn't matter to Madame Tong. The exposure confirmed her hypothesis. People wanted to look at Ada. Men were willing to pay attention. And in Hong Kong, attention could be converted into currency. The mother began to groom the daughter. The rhetoric in the house changed. It was no longer just about Ada doing chores. It was about Ada saving the family. Madame Tong began to implant the idea that Ada's beauty was a divine gift meant to lift them out of squalor. If Ada could become a star, the loan sharks would go away. The midnight knocks would stop. The red paint would be scrubbed clean. It was a heavy burden to place on a teenager, the responsibility for the entire financial survival of a household. The Miss Hong Kong pageant of the early 90s was not merely a beauty contest. It was a national obsession, a cultural colossus that commanded the attention of the entire territory. In a city fueled by hypercapitalism and the frantic energy of the pre-handover years, the pageant was the ultimate elevator pitch. It promised that a girl from the housing estates could, with enough grace, poise, and swimsuit charisma, be elevated instantly into the aristocracy of fame. It was the Cinderella myth, industrialized and broadcast leave to millions. But for 17-year-old Ada Choi, the lights of the Hong Kong Coliseum, the cavernous arena where the finals were held, did not represent a dream. They represented a high-stakes interrogation. The year was 1991. The summer air in Hong Kong was thick with humidity and the smell of money. Ada, barely out of adolescence, stood backstage, surrounded by the chaotic symphony of a live television production. The hiss of hairspray, the shouting of stage managers, the frantic rustle of silk and sequins. While other contestants were driven by personal ambition or the vanity of youth, Ada was driven by a terrified imperative implanted by her mother. She had to win. She wasn't chasing the crown or the glory. She was chasing the solvency of the Tong family. Madame Tong, the architect of this campaign, viewed the pageant not as a competition of beauty, but as a marketing launch. She had groomed Ada for this moment since the girl turned 15, entering her in modeling contests, refining her look, treating her daughter's puberty as the development phase of a lucrative product. As Ada stood in the wings, waiting for her cue, the weight on her slender shoulders was crushing. She knew that back in their cramped apartment, or perhaps sitting right there in the dark stands, her mother was calculating the odds. Every smile Ada flashed at the camera was a potential payment on a gambling debt. Every misstep was a disaster that would bring the loan sharks closer to their door. When Ada walked out onto the stage, the transformation was terrifyingly professional. The camera captured a vision of youthful perfection, tall, statuesque, with a face that combined the innocence of a child with the striking features of a classic beauty. She moved with a liquid grace, her smile beaming 1,000 watts of joy into the living rooms of Hong Kong. But this was a performance of the highest order. Inside, she was a bundle of raw nerves, a 17-year-old girl who just wanted to be safe, who wanted to be invisible, forced instead to parade her body before a panel of judges and a city of critics. The swimsuit segment, always the most controversial and highly rated portion of the evening, was particularly harrowing. For a girl raised in a chaotic, broken home, exposed early to the harsh realities of debt and evasion, stripping down to a bathing suit on national television felt less like liberation and more like an appraisal. She was livestock at a county fair being assessed for her market value. The judges looked at her lines, her posture, her measurements. The audience cheered. But in the silence of her own mind, Ada must have felt the profound isolation of the sacrificial lamb. She wasn't winning affection. She was generating equity. The climax of the night saw Ada crowned as the second runner-up. She didn't take the top prize, that went to Amy Kwok, but in the grand scheme of Madame Tong's calculations, third place was a victory. It was enough. It was the seal of approval from the establishment. It legitimized Ada as a Miss Hong Kong, a title that carried immense social currency. Standing on the podium, holding flowers that smelled of victory, Ada smiled through tears that the audience interpreted as joy. Only she knew they were tears of exhaustion. She had survived the gauntlet. She had done her duty. She thought, perhaps naively, that this achievement would satisfy the beast of her mother's addiction. She was wrong. The sash and the tiara were not the finish line. They were merely the entry pass into the next circle of exploitation. Television Broadcast Limited, better known as TVB, signing the contract with TVB in 1991, was akin to enlisting in an army. The station was a factory, a relentless content mill that churned out dramas at a breakneck pace to feed the insatiable appetite of the Asian market. For a rookie actress like Ada, there was no glamour. There was only the iron schedule. Her life became a blur of studio lights and styrofoam lunchboxes. She worked 20-hour days, often sleeping in the makeup chair or on a prop sofa between takes. She was thrown into ancient costumes for wuxia dramas in the morning, wielding plastic swords and flying on wires, only to change into modern business suits for a contemporary soap opera in the afternoon. The physical toll was immense. She was still a teenager, her body still developing, yet she was subjected to a regimen that would break a seasoned laborer. But Ada did not complain. In fact, she threw herself into the work with a desperate intensity. She believed in the logic of labor. If she worked hard, if she became famous, she would earn enough money to clear the debts. She thought she could outwork her mother's vice. She became known in the studios for her obedience, her willingness to take any role, no matter how small or physically demanding. She was the good girl, the dutiful daughter, grinding her youth into dust for a monthly paycheck. However, the cruel irony of the entertainment industry soon revealed itself. Fame, Ada discovered, was a double-edged sword that cut deep. As her face began to appear nightly on television screens across Hong Kong, she didn't just attract fans, she attracted creditors. The loan sharks, the triads, and the underground bookies who held Madame Tong's I O Us saw Ada on TV and saw a golden opportunity. In their logic, if the daughter was a star, the mother must be or, at the very least, the daughter had a reputation to lose. The harassment escalated from private threats to professional sabotage. The phone calls to the TVB switchboard began. Mysterious men would hang around the studio gates at TV City in Clearwater Bay, watching for Ada's car. The sanctuary of the workplace was breached. Every time the director yelled "cut," Ada wasn't checking her pager for messages from friends. She was terrified of receiving a message that said the debt had doubled or that her mother was being held somewhere. The salary from TVB, while decent for a young girl, was mathematically insignificant against the black hole of Madame Tong's gambling. A few $1,000s a month could barely cover the interest on the loans, let alone the principal. Madame Tong, emboldened by her daughter's visibility, began to gamble with even greater recklessness. She used Ada's fame as a line of credit. "Don't you know who my daughter is?" became her mantra at the mahjong tables. She was betting with Ada's face, wagering Ada's future. Ada would come home after a 20-hour shift, eyes burning with fatigue, only to find her mother manic with the adrenaline of a new loss, demanding money that Ada didn't have. The arguments were screams in the night, heard through the thin walls of their apartment. Ada would cry, begging her mother to stop, to let them live a normal life. But an addict does not hear pleas. They only hear the rattle of the dice. The disparity between Ada's public image and her private reality became grotesque. On screen, she played princesses, heroines, women of power and destiny. She was styled in beautiful clothes, lit by soft focus lenses, adored by millions. Off-screen, she was a prisoner of poverty and fear, scavenging for coins to pay off thugs, terrified that tomorrow the headlines would scream, "Miss Hong Kong's mother, chased by triads." This period, from late 1991 to early 1992, was the incubation phase of her tragedy. It was the time when Ada realized that the system was rigged. The harder she worked, the deeper the hole became. The theater of the absurd wasn't the pageant stage. It was her life. She was running on a treadmill that was set to a speed she couldn't match, with her mother standing at the controls, cranking it higher and higher. It became painfully, heartbreakingly clear to the 18-year-old girl that an honest living would not save them. The math simply didn't work. The debt was a living monster, growing faster than her salary ever could. She needed a miracle. She needed a sum of money so large it existed only in the realm of tycoons and kings. And so, the trap set at the Regent Hotel, that lavish 18th birthday party funded by Joseph Lau, snapped shut. The transaction was finalized. Ada stepped from the grueling sound stages of TVB directly into the gilded cage of the filial mistress, exchanging her youth for the capital needed to keep the loan sharks at bay. The gravity of this transition was rooted in the fin de siècle decadence of Hong Kong society in the early 1990s. It was a time of frantic hedonism, a city racing towards the 1997 handover with a frantic hedonism. In this ecosystem, tycoons were the new emperors, and Joseph Lau was among the most formidable. Known in the tabloids as the stock market sniper, Lau was a man who acquired companies with the same predatory efficiency that he acquired women. He was 39 years old, vastly wealthy, and possessed a reputation that was a complex cocktail of ruthlessness and generosity. For Ada, the relationship was never ambiguous. It was a rescue mission. The arrangement was stark in its simplicity. Lau would provide the capital to plug the hemorrhaging wound of Madame Tong's gambling debts, and in return, Ada would provide companionship, youth, and beauty. It was a transaction of flesh and soul, sanitized by the veneer of high society dating. But unlike the standard narrative of the gold digger, the woman who claws her way into a billionaire's bed for diamonds and status, Ada entered this union with the reluctance of a martyr walking to the stake. Joseph Lau, to his credit, was not a brute. He was a sophisticated man who prided himself on his treatment of women. He recognized something in Ada that distinguished her from the other celebrities who orbited his world. While others might have been driven by vanity or greed, Ada was driven by a terrified, heartbreaking filial piety. She was obedient. She was good. She didn't ask for yachts. She asked for her mother not to be killed by triads. This distinction seemingly touched a chord in the tycoon. He treated her with a gentleness that confused the public narrative. He became, in a twisted sense, her protector, the only barrier standing between her family and total annihilation. But protection came at a price. The price was Ada's identity. From 1991 onwards, Ada was thrust into a lifestyle of suffocating opulence that she had never asked for and could not enjoy. Lau showered her with gifts that were widely reported in the press, luxury properties, including penthouse units at the Mayfair in the mid-levels, a prestigious address that screamed old money. He gave her jewelry, designer clothes, and access to the most exclusive circles in Asia. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale. "Look at the lucky girl," the gossips whispered, from the housing estates to the penthouse. But for Ada, these properties were not homes. They were silos for money laundering. The deeds might have been in her name, but the utility of the assets was strictly for her mother. The apartments were mortgaged, remortgaged, or sold to pay off the endless stream of debts. Ada was living inside a giant ATM machine, watching the walls being liquidated brick by brick to feed the casinos in Macau. She was living a bizarre paradox. She was the poorest rich woman in Hong Kong. She would step out of a Rolls-Royce wearing a Chanel gown, flash a smile for the paparazzi, and then go home to worry about utility bills or the next threatening phone call. The disconnect between her public image and her private reality was a psychological torture chamber. She was trapped in a golden cage, and the bars were made of public perception. The media played a brutal role in this chapter of her life. The Hong Kong paparazzi, the notorious dog pups, were merciless. They didn't investigate the coercion or the gambling addiction of the mother. That story was too depressing, too complex. Instead, they sold the easy narrative, the vixen. They painted Ada as a seductress who had ensnared a married billionaire. They dissected her body, her clothes, and her spending habits with misogynistic glee. Every time she was photographed with Lau, the captions were scathing. They called her a homewrecker, a canary in a gilded cage. They speculated on her monthly allowance. For a young woman who had been raised with traditional values, who deep down craved respectability and a normal family life, this public shaming was agonizing. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't hold a press conference and say, "I'm doing this so my mother doesn't get her legs broken." That would be a betrayal of the very parent she was sacrificing herself to save. So she swallowed the humiliation. She wore the label of mistress like a scarlet letter, burning silently against her skin. The psychological toll of being a kept woman is profound. It erodes the sense of self-efficacy. Ada began to feel that her only value lay in her physical appearance. Her acting career at TVB, which she continued to pursue doggedly, became her only lifeline to reality, her only claim to dignity. On set, she wasn't Joseph Lau's girlfriend. She was a professional. She memorized her lines perfectly. She never arrived late. She treated every crew member with respect. It was as if she was trying to scrub away the stain of her private life with the detergent of hard work. But even at TVB, the shadow of Lau loomed. Colleagues whispered. Producers treated her with a mix of deference and disdain. Deference because of who her patron was, and disdain because they believed she hadn't earned her place. She was isolated. How could she relate to other girls her age? How could she complain about a bad boyfriend or a missed bus when she was living in a multi-million-dollar apartment paid for by a tycoon? Her tragedy was too expensive for sympathy. The relationship with Lau lasted for 6 years. 6 years is an eternity in the life of a young adult. It spans the crucial development from 18 to 24. These are the years a woman usually discovers who she is, makes mistakes, falls in love, finds her voice. Ada spent these years as a satellite orbiting a powerful man. She learned the etiquette of the super rich, which fork to use, how to nod politely at boring dinner parties, how to disappear when business was discussed. She became an exquisite ornament. Yet within the confines of this transactional relationship, a strange dynamic emerged. Lau, perhaps realizing the depth of her sacrifice, reportedly advised her on financial matters, teaching her the basics of real estate and investment. It was a dark mentorship. He was teaching her how to manage the very wealth that was destroying her family. But no amount of financial literacy could fix the leak in the bucket. The insatiable nature of Madame Tong's addiction meant that the contract could never be fulfilled. The goalposts were constantly moving. Ada would think, just one more year, just one more property sale. Then we are free. But the freedom never came. The 100 million Hong Kong dollar figure that is often cited was not a lump sum. It was a running total, a scorecard of misery that kept ticking upward. There were nights in the penthouse when Ada would stand by the window looking out at the glittering skyline of Victoria Harbor, a view that people would kill for, and feel an overwhelming urge to jump. The luxury felt like a mockery. The silk sheets felt like shrouds. She was possessed by two owners, Joseph Lau, who owned her time, and her mother, who owned her guilt. She was developing a condition known as learned helplessness. After years of trying to fill a bottomless pit, the mind begins to accept that struggle is futile. You stop fighting. You just endure. You become numb. Ada's smiles in photographs from this era have a glassy, brittle quality. The light behind the eyes was dimming. She was functioning on autopilot, a beautiful robot programmed to generate cash and deflect scandal. The tragedy of the billionaire's doll phase wasn't just the loss of virtue or reputation, it was the suspension of time. Ada Choi was frozen in a state of perpetual debt servitude. She was growing older, but she wasn't growing up. She was merely surviving, day by breathless day, waiting for a permission to live that no one was going to give her. She would have to take it for herself, but the courage to do that was still years away. For now, she had to put on the dress, check her makeup in the mirror, and walk out the door to play the role she had been sold into, the role of the happy, lucky, enviable mistress, the role of a lifetime paid for in tears. If the relationship with Joseph Lau was the deal with the devil, then the years between 1994 and 1999 were the period when the devil came to collect his due with interest. The tragedy of Ada Choi's sacrifice lies in a cruel economic paradox. The more she paid, the more her mother lost. Most observers assumed that the injection of Joseph Lau's millions would act as a tourniquet, stopping the bleeding of the Tong family finances. They were wrong. The money acted as an accelerant. It was gasoline poured onto a forest fire. The reason lay in the eyes of the addict. Madame Tong, now emboldened by her daughter's connection to one of Hong Kong's wealthiest men, underwent a terrifying transformation. She no longer saw herself as a desperate debtor. She saw herself as a VIP. In her deluded logic, she was now royalty by association. She walked into the casinos of Macau, the neon-drenched gambling capital across the Pearl River Delta, not with the humility of a woman who had nearly destroyed her family, but with the swagger of a high roller. The Casino Lisboa, with its garish birdcage architecture and labyrinthine halls, became her second home. In the VIP rooms, where the air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigarettes and the silence was heavy with tension, Madame Tong became a legend for all the wrong reasons. She didn't bet to win. She bet to feel. She placed wagers that would make seasoned gamblers wince. 50,000 on a single hand of baccarat, 100,000 on a spin of the roulette wheel. She wasn't gambling with money, she was gambling with Ada's blood. The mechanics of her addiction were parasitic. Madame Tong knew that she had the ultimate insurance policy back in Hong Kong. If she won, the money was hers to squander. If she lost, Ada would fix it. Ada had to fix it. The mother had weaponized her daughter's fame. She knew that Ada's greatest fear was not poverty, but scandal. She knew that Ada would do anything, pay any amount, sign any paper to keep the loan sharks away from the TVB studios, to keep the shame off the front pages. This leverage created a bottomless pit. The 100 million Hong Kong dollar figure that haunts this narrative was not a static debt. It was a living, breathing hydra. Ada would spend months liquidating assets, selling a flat, pawning jewelry given to her by Lau, emptying her savings account to clear a $10 million debt. She would hand the money over, trembling with relief, thinking the nightmare was over. And 2 weeks later, Madame Tong would return from Macau, pale and shaking, confessing that she had lost another 12 million. The cycle was relentless. It defied the laws of mathematics and sanity. As the 90s progressed, the situation grew darker. The gentlemanly agreements with established creditors gave way to the chaotic violence of the triads. When legitimate banks and licensed moneylenders stopped extending credit to Madame Tong, she turned to the Dai Yi Lung, the loan sharks of the underworld. These were not men who sent overdue notices. These were men who operated on a currency of fear and flesh. The terror tactics began to bleed into Ada's physical reality. The sanctuary of her home was violated. One morning, Ada opened the door of her apartment to find the corridor splashed with red paint. In Hong Kong culture, this is a visceral, terrifying symbol. It represents blood. It is a death threat, painted in gloss enamel. It screams to the neighbors, to the building security, to everyone. Someone here owes money to dangerous people. For a celebrity, this was nuclear fallout. Ada was trying to maintain the image of a glamorous TV star, a beauty queen. But when she walked out of her door, she had to step over puddles of red paint that looked like a crime scene. She had to lower her head and rush past whispering neighbors who viewed her family as a plague. The shame was corrosive. It ate away at her confidence, making her feel dirty, contaminated. The harassment didn't stop at the doorstep. The triads began to target her workplace. TVB City, the sprawling studio complex where Ada worked, was supposed to be a fortress, but the creditors found ways to penetrate it. Anonymous phone calls flooded the reception desk. Tell Ada Choi to pay up or we will come for her. Funeral wreaths, traditional symbols of death sent to the living as a curse, were delivered to the studio gates with her name on them. For a young woman in her early 20s, trying to memorize lines for a romantic comedy while wondering if a hitman is waiting in the parking lot was a state of permanent hypervigilance. Her cortisol levels were permanently spiked. On set, she would sometimes faint, not from the heat of the lights or the weight of the costumes, but from the sheer crushing weight of terror. Her body was revolting against the stress. Yet she kept working. She had no choice. She was the only engine keeping the ship afloat. She took on a punishing schedule, filming back-to-back dramas, appearing in variety shows, cutting ribbons at shopping mall openings. Every check she earned was signed over before the ink was dry. She became a conduit for cash, a human laundering machine washing her mother's sins. Ada was trapped by a heartbreaking logic. She had already sacrificed her innocence, her reputation, and 6 years of her life to this cause. To stop now would mean admitting that all that pain was for nothing. She kept thinking, if I just pay this last one, Mom will stop. She promised she would stop. But Madame Tong was an artist of manipulation. When Ada threatened to cut her off, the mother would stage elaborate scenes of remorse. She would weep, kneel, threaten suicide. She would play the filial piety card, that ancient heavy Confucian guilt trip. I gave birth to you. I raised you. How can you abandon me? She twisted love into a shackle. By 1998, the relationship with Joseph Lau had dissolved. The billionaire, for all his wealth, had grown tired of the black hole. He had realized that no amount of money could fill the void of Madame Tong's addiction. When he withdrew his protection, the buffer zone vanished. Ada was now standing alone in the path of the storm. The debt stood at a staggering sum. The interest alone was accumulating faster than Ada could earn it. She was drowning. She was looking at her bank account, which should have been full after a decade of stardom, and seeing zero. Actually, she was seeing negative numbers. She had nothing. No savings, no assets, no future. Just a mother who looked at her with hungry eyes, asking, when is the next payday? The bottomless pit had finally swallowed the last of her hope. Ada realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that she was not saving her mother. She was merely prolonging the inevitable crash. And if she didn't let go of the rope, she would be pulled over the edge along with her. The stage was set for the millennium. The year 2000 was approaching, a time of new beginnings for the world and a time of reckoning for Ada Choi. She was about to do the unthinkable. She was about to break the sacred commandment of the Asian family. She was about to declare war on her own mother. By the late 1990s, Ada Choi had ascended to the very pinnacle of the Hong Kong entertainment industry, achieving the coveted status of a Fadan, a top-tier leading lady at TVB. Her image was inescapable, plastered across billboards in the bustling MTR stations, gracing the glossy covers of weekly magazines, and beamed into millions of living rooms every evening during prime time. To the outside world, she was the epitome of glamorous success, a Cinderella story made flesh, draped in designer fashion and radiating a signature charisma that seemed to captivate the camera lens. However, this dazzling visibility was nothing more than a meticulously constructed facade, a thin veneer hiding a schizophrenic existence that tore her psyche apart. Ada was living two irreconcilable lives simultaneously: the adored celebrity who commanded respect and admiration on screen, and the indentured servant who lived in abject terror off it. When the director yelled action, she could step into a world of order and agency, inhabiting characters, doctors, lawyers, ancient princesses who possessed the power to solve their problems and control their destinies. Acting became more than a profession. It was a psychological survival mechanism, a necessary dissociation that allowed her to escape the crushing reality of her own life for 45 minutes at a time. She threw herself into her work with a manic, almost desperate intensity, earning a reputation among her colleagues as a tireless workaholic. Yet few realized that she wasn't working for ambition or accolades, but because the soundstage was the only sanctuary where the phone didn't ring with threats from the underworld. The moment the camera stopped rolling, however, the fantasy evaporated, and the cruel machinery of her reality resumed its grinding motion. The nightly drive home from the studio was not a journey to rest, but a descent into dread. While her peers in the industry were heading to the trendy bars of Lan Kwai Fong or returning to the comfort of their families, Ada was mentally paralyzed by the calculation of compounding interest rates. Her mother, Madame Tong, now deprived of the massive financial buffer once provided by Joseph Lau, had lost all tether to reality, spiraling deeper into a gambling mania that defied all logic. The creditors were no longer the polite intermediaries of banks or high-end casinos. They had been replaced by the brutal enforcers of the Dai Yi Lung, the loan sharks. The humiliation of this period was granular and pervasive, manifesting not just in the looming macro debt, but in the agonizing microaggressions of daily poverty amidst perceived wealth. There were days when Ada, despite being one of the most famous women in the territory, stood on set with empty pockets, her salary having been garnished or transferred immediately to cover urgent interest payments before she could even touch it. She found herself in the surreal and degrading position of having to borrow small sums of money from makeup artists and production assistants just to buy a box lunch, fabricating excuses about forgotten wallets or banking errors, while seeing the flicker of pity or suspicion in their eyes. This financial insolvency was a corrosive acid that ate away at her self-worth, particularly in the face-saving culture of Hong Kong, where wealth is often conflated with moral standing. The sanctuary of her workplace, TVB City, which should have been an impenetrable fortress of creativity, was breached by the tendrils of the criminal underworld. The harassment evolved from private letters to a campaign of public terror designed to maximize shame. The studio switchboard was flooded with anonymous, menacing phone calls demanding payment, and ominous messages were left with receptionists explicitly threatening Ada's safety. The psychological terror of knowing that the triads knew her schedule, her location, and her vulnerabilities created a state of permanent hyper-vigilance. Every time a production assistant called her name unexpectedly, she flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting to see a gang of thugs marching onto the set to drag her away. This was not paranoia. It was a statistical probability in a city where the lines between the entertainment industry and organized crime were often blurred. The terror followed her home, violating the sanctity of her private space. On several occasions, she returned to her apartment to find the corridor splashed with red paint, a visceral, terrified symbol in Chinese culture that mimics blood and serves as a public declaration of debt and death. Walking past that crimson stain, lowering her head to avoid the judgmental whispers of neighbors who viewed her family as a plague, stripped Ada of the last remnants of her dignity. She was a queen on television, but in the elevator of her own building, she was a pariah. It was within this suffocating crucible, around 1999, that Ada found a fleeting, tragic solace in the arms of Nicky Wu. Their romance remains one of the most heartbreaking footnotes in the history of Asian entertainment, less a love story and more a collision of two wounded souls. Nicky was a superstar in his own right, a former member of the legendary Little Tigers. Yet behind his idol persona, he carried a burden that mirrored Ada's with eerie precision. His father had made disastrous business investments, saddling the family with a crushing debt estimated at 20 million Hong Kong dollars, forcing Nicky into the same cycle of indentured labor. When they met, the connection was instant and visceral. They didn't need to explain the unexplainable shame of the red paint or the sleepless nights. They recognized the exhaustion in each other's eyes, forming a trauma bond born in the trenches of familial exploitation. For a brief moment, they were the golden couple in the eyes of the public, but in private, they were two drowning swimmers trying desperately to keep each other afloat. Their dates were not filled with romantic frivolity, but with shared anxieties about repayment schedules and the hopelessness of their situations. Ultimately, the laws of buoyancy prevailed. The combined weight of their family's debts was simply too heavy for their relationship to sustain. They were fighting a war on two fronts, and the stress was insurmountable. They separated not for lack of love, but for lack of oxygen, victims of a financial pressure that crushed the possibility of a shared future. The collapse of this relationship was a devastating psychological blow to Ada, reinforcing a terrifying worldview that she was inherently toxic, that her baggage was too heavy for anyone to share, and that she was destined to navigate this hellscape alone. As the new millennium approached, Madame Tong's behavior escalated from desperate to delusional, transforming from a struggling addict into a predatory force. The loss of the billionaire's protection and the realization that Ada's TVB salary had a hard mathematical limit sent the mother into a panic. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. She began to view her daughter not as a child to be protected, but as a hostile asset withholding resources. The emotional manipulation turned sinister and theatrical. She would scream that Ada was unfilial, the ultimate sin in Confucian culture, accusing her of hoarding money while her mother suffered. When verbal abuse failed to extract cash, she staged elaborate scenes of self-harm, threatening to jump off buildings or swallow pills if Ada did not produce millions by a certain deadline. Ada was trapped in a cycle of emotional terrorism, conditioned since childhood to believe that her mother's life was literally in her hands, and that any refusal would make her a matricidal monster. The betrayal deepened when Madame Tong began forging Ada's signature on loan documents, leveraging her daughter's fame to borrow from increasingly dangerous underground sources without Ada's consent. Ada would wake up to find she owed vast sums to people she had never met, her identity stolen piece by the woman who gave her birth. By late 1999, Ada Choi was spiritually and financially bankrupt. After a decade of stardom, her net worth was effectively negative. She had no savings, no unencumbered assets, and no future, only a closet full of costumes and a mountain of enemies. The physical toll was undeniable. She became alarmingly thin, her eyes sunken and dull, her body revolting against the chronic cortisol spike. Insomnia became her constant companion as she lay awake, listening to the sounds of the city, wondering if this was the night the door would be kicked in. Dark fantasies of suicide began to drift into her mind, not as a tragedy but as a logical solution, a way to stop the meter running, to end the shame, to finally escape the noise. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, looking at her smiling image on billboards with a profound sense of disconnection. The breaking point was not a single explosion, but a quiet, chilling realization that dawned on her after yet another screaming match. She looked at her mother and saw not a parent, but a predator who would never be satiated. She realized that Madame Tong would consume everything: Ada's money, her youth, her love, her sanity, until there was nothing left but dry bones. The bottomless pit would never be filled. Ada realized with cold clarity that she had two choices: continue to be the filial daughter and perish, or become the unfilial traitor and survive. The pressure cooker had no safety valve left, and as the year 2000 dawned, Ada Choi prepared to light a match that would burn down the house of cards her mother had built, setting herself on fire in the process to rise from the ashes. The turn of the millennium was celebrated globally as a moment of hope and renewal, a digital and cultural reset for humanity. But for Ada Choi, the year 2000 marked the terminal velocity of her descent. The silence that had shrouded her family's dark secret for nearly a decade was no longer a shield. It had become a shroud, suffocating her slowly. By November of that year, the situation had devolved from a financial crisis into a matter of life and death. The catalyst for the final explosion was not a gradual accumulation of stress, but a sudden, terrifying demand. Just as Ada believed she had stabilized the situation, a new creditor emerged from the shadows, presenting a debt so colossal, a fresh figure amounting to over 5 million Hong Kong dollars demanded instantly that it shattered whatever fragile resolve she had left. This was not a debt she could work off. It was not a figure she could beg from friends. It was a mathematical impossibility. For the first time, Ada Choi looked at the numbers and realized that even if she sold her blood, it wouldn't be enough. The Iron Lady, Madame Tong, had managed to gamble away her daughter's past, present, and future, and was now demanding her soul as collateral. The decision to hold the press conference on November 4th, 2000, was the most dangerous performance of Ada Choi's career. It was an act of cultural suicide. In the deeply traditional Confucian society of Hong Kong, the concept of xiao is the bedrock of morality. It dictates that a child's debt to their parents is absolute and eternal, a bond that transcends logic, fairness, or abuse. To publicly shame one's parent, to air the family's dirty laundry before the world, is considered a profound moral failing, a loss of face so severe it can end a career and invite social ostracization. Ada knew this. She knew that by stepping onto that podium, she wasn't just exposing her mother. She was risking her own status as a beloved public figure. She was effectively declaring herself an unfilial daughter in a culture that worships obedience. Yet the alternative was literally fatal. She later confessed that in the days leading up to the announcement, she had stood on the precipice of suicide, seeing death as the only valid exit clause from her mother's contract. The press conference was, therefore, a survival instinct kicking in, a desperate, clawing attempt to choose life over face. The atmosphere in the conference room was funereal. This was not a promotional event for a new drama. There were no sponsors' logos, no smiling co-stars, no pre-approved questions. Ada appeared stripped of her usual armor. Gone were the designer gowns and the poised Miss Hong Kong smile. She wore a simple outfit, her face devoid of heavy makeup, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed from days of weeping. Flanked by her manager and a few close TVB executives who had witnessed her silent torture, she looked less like a star and more like a wreckage. The reporters, usually a raucous and cynical bunch, sensed the gravity of the moment. As Ada took the microphone, a heavy silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. When she began to speak, her voice was trembling, fracturing under the weight of 10 years of suppressed trauma. She didn't read from a prepared PR script. She spoke from the open wound of her life. "I have no money left," she sobbed, the words tearing through the room like a physical blow. "I have sold everything. I have nothing left to give." For the next 20 minutes, Ada Choi dismantled the myth of her glamorous life. She laid bare the grotesque reality of the bottomless pit she had been shoveling money into since she was a teenager. She revealed the figure that made headlines across Asia, over 100 million Hong Kong dollars. She detailed how she had mortgaged her properties, drained her savings, and borrowed from friends, only to watch it all vanish into the casinos of Macau. "I cannot do it anymore," she declared, her voice rising in a crescendo of hysteria and liberation. "I cannot be responsible for her debts anymore. If anyone lends her money because of me, I will not pay it back. I cannot pay it back." It was a declaration of independence signed in tears. It was a public severance of the mother-daughter bond, a brutal amputation necessary to save the rest of the body from gangrene. The reaction to the press conference was seismic. Hong Kong society was shaken to its core. For years, the rumors about Ada's mother had been whispered in gossip columns, treated as tabloid fodder, but hearing the raw, unfiltered confirmation from Ada herself shifted the narrative instantly. The image of the greedy gold digger that had plagued Ada during her years with Joseph Lau evaporated, replaced by the tragic image of the filial martyr. The public realized with a collective shock that the luxury apartments and the high society lifestyle were not the spoils of vanity, but the tools of servitude. The sympathy was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a dark fascination. Ada had broken the fourth wall of celebrity. She had shown the ugly, rotting scaffolding beneath the glittering facade. She had admitted that the Hong Kong dream, that beauty and hard work lead to happiness, was a lie in the face of addiction. However, the aftermath was not a clean break. It was a messy, violent fallout. Madame Tong did not accept this public humiliation with grace. The Iron Lady struck back with the ferocity of a cornered animal. In the weeks following the press conference, she launched a counter-offensive that was breathtaking in its cruelty. She contacted the media, accusing Ada of being ungrateful, of lying, of abandoning the woman who gave her birth. She spun narratives about how she had sacrificed everything for Ada's career, twisting history to paint herself as the victim of a heartless, fame-obsessed daughter. The lowest point came when Madame Tong reportedly staged a mock funeral for herself, a grotesque piece of emotional theater designed to guilt Ada into submission, to show the world that her daughter had killed her. This psychological warfare was public, messy, and deeply scarring. It forced Ada to relive the trauma daily in the headlines, turning her liberation into a spectacle of family dysfunction. For Ada, the immediate period following the press conference was a dark night of the soul. She had expected that cutting ties would bring relief, and in a financial sense it did. The creditors, realizing the cash cow was officially closed for business, stopped their harassment of the daughter and turned their focus solely on the mother. But emotionally, Ada fell into a void. She was 27 years old, and she had just publicly orphaned herself. The guilt was crushing. Despite the abuse, despite the theft of her youth, the biological imperative to love and protect one's mother is hardwired. Ada wrestled with the agonizing doubt. Did I do the right thing? Am I a monster? She withdrew from the public eye, unable to face the cameras that had just captured her breakdown. She fell into a deep depression, isolating herself in her apartment, a home that was finally hers, but felt emptier than ever. The silence she had craved was now deafening. Crucially, this event marked the death of the old Ada. The naive girl who believed she could fix everything with a smile and a check was gone. The obedient doll who allowed herself to be passed between a gambling mother and a billionaire tycoon had been incinerated in the flashbulbs of that press conference. What remained was a survivor, battered, exhausted, and scarred, but finally free. She was standing in the ruins of her life, looking at the wreckage of her family and her reputation. She had $0 in her bank account. She had no boyfriend. She had no mother. But for the first time in her adult life, she owned something priceless, her own future. She had reclaimed the deed to her soul, even if the price had been everything else she possessed. The industry watched with bated breath. Many predicted this was the end of Ada Choi. Who would hire a heavy, tragic figure for lighthearted dramas? Who would want a spokesperson with such bad feng shui? The stigma of the scandal was heavy. Producers worried that the drama of her real life would overshadow any role she played. For an agonizing stretch of time, the phone stopped ringing. Ada was left alone with her Bible and her demons, facing the terrifying task of rebuilding a self-identity that had been entirely constructed around pleasing others. She had to learn who Ada Choi was when she wasn't paying a debt. She had to learn how to live not for survival, but for existence. This was the rock bottom. But in the physics of resilience, the bottom is the only place from which you can push off. Unbeknownst to the tabloids writing her obituary, Ada was not finished. She was merely in the chrysalis phase, a painful liquid state of transformation. The filial mistress was dead. The phoenix was about to be born, rising not from the ashes of a mythical fire, but from the very real, gritty, and heartbreaking rubble of November 2000. The journey from this point would require a different kind of strength. Not the strength of endurance, which she had mastered, but the strength of reinvention. And the first step of that reinvention would be finding a father figure who wouldn't sell her, a love that didn't cost money, and a faith that offered forgiveness for the sin of saving oneself. The morning after the press conference, Ada Choi woke up to a silence so profound it felt violent. For 10 years, her life had been a cacophony of screaming creditors, ringing phones, and the hysterical demands of her mother. The adrenaline of the crisis had been the fuel that kept her moving, a toxic energy that forced her out of bed and onto the soundstage. Now that noise was gone. The creditors, realizing the public declaration meant the cash flow had truly ceased, retreated into the shadows to harass the mother directly, leaving the daughter in a terrifying vacuum. Ada sat in her apartment, surrounded by the physical trappings of a successful life, yet she felt utterly hollowed out. She was suffering from a psychological condition often seen in long-term hostages or prisoners of war upon their release, the inability to function without the structure of their captivity. For a decade, her entire identity had been constructed around the architecture of debt. She was the filial daughter, the savior, the provider. Every role she played, every check she signed, every humiliation she endured had a clear purpose: to keep the family afloat. Now, with the debt severed, that purpose evaporated. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. Who was Ada Choi if she wasn't paying for someone else's sins? The liberation she had fought for didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a free fall into an abyss. The weeks and months following November 2000 were characterized by a crushing Great Depression. The Hong Kong media, having feasted on the explosion of her family drama, moved on to the next scandal, leaving Ada to pick through the wreckage alone. The social isolation was palpable. In the superstitious and image-conscious world of the Hong Kong entertainment industry, misfortune is viewed as contagious. Ada was no longer the glamorous starlet. She was a tragedy, a woman with bad feng shui. Friends she had once partied with stopped calling, unsure of what to say to a woman who had just publicly executed her relationship with her mother. Producers at TVB treated her with a fragile caution, as if she were a piece of porcelain that had already shattered and been glued back together poorly. On set, the whisper stopped when she entered the room, replaced by a pitying silence that was far worse than the gossip. She went to work, she said her lines, she went home. She lived in a monochromatic loop, eating mechanical meals, staring at the television without seeing it, and sleeping fitfully, haunted by nightmares of the past. The phantom limb pain of the debt was real. She would wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for her checkbook, only to realize there was no one left to pay. It was during this dark night of the soul that Ada brushed against the very edge of self-destruction. The suicide ideation she had harbored during the worst of the debt crisis did not vanish overnight. It mutated. Before, death was an escape from pain. Now death seemed like a logical conclusion to a life that had lost its meaning. She felt used up, like a husk that had been squeezed dry of all vitality. She was 27, an age when most women are entering their prime. Yet she felt ancient, burdened with the weariness of 100 lifetimes. She wrote in her journals about feeling dirty, about the shame of her past relationships, specifically the transactional nature of her years with Joseph Lau. The public might have forgiven her, viewing her as a victim, But she had not forgiven herself. She internalized the label of mistress, believing she was damaged goods, unworthy of a normal life or a pure love. The internal monologue was a relentless loop of self-hatred. You are trash. You sold yourself. You abandoned your mother. You deserve this loneliness. However, the trajectory of Ada Choi's life was altered, not by a new movie role or a romantic partner, but by a profound spiritual intervention. In the depths of her despair, she found herself drawn to a community that operated outside the transactional logic of Hong Kong society, the Christian church. This was not a sudden, cinematic road to Damascus moment with blinding lights. It was a slow, tentative crawl towards a source of warmth. Invited by colleagues like Sharon Tang, another actress who had navigated the brutal highs and lows of fame, Ada stepped into a world where her value was not determined by her bank account, her beauty, or her ability to service a debt. For the first time in her life, she heard a message of grace, the radical idea that love is given freely, not earned through sacrifice or payment. This concept was alien to her. Her entire existence had been a transaction. I pay, therefore I am loved. The church offered a new paradigm. You are loved, therefore you are. The process of spiritual healing was grueling. It required Ada to deconstruct the iron logic her mother had installed in her brain. She had to learn that saying no was not a sin. She had to learn that her body was not a commodity. She had to learn that forgiveness was not about condoning her mother's abuse, but about releasing the poison of resentment that was killing her. There were nights of weeping, prayer sessions that lasted until dawn, and long conversations with mentors who helped her separate her biological identity from her traumatic history. Slowly, the color began to return to her world. The frantic anxiety in her eyes was replaced by a quiet stillness. She stopped looking for a savior in the form of a wealthy man and began to find strength in a higher power. This faith became the bedrock of her new identity. It gave her the courage to set boundaries, to refuse roles that exploited her sexuality, and to speak openly about her struggles without shame. She realized that her story, the very tragedy she tried to hide, could be a testimony. But the world outside the church walls was still harsh. Professionally, Ada was stuck in a strange purgatory. While she was still a lead actress, her career had plateaued. The golden era of Hong Kong cinema was fading, and the industry was changing. Ada was typecast. Producers saw her as the weeping beauty, the tragic heroine. They wanted her to cry on camera because they knew she was good at it. She had practiced for a decade. She felt trapped in her own image, repeating the same emotional beats of suffering for an audience that consumed her pain as entertainment. She yearned for something different, a role that would allow her to show her strength, her wit, her fire, not just her tears. But the scripts that landed on her desk were variations of the same theme, the victim. She was working, yes, but she wasn't growing. She was treading water in a sea of mediocrity, waiting for a current that would carry her to a new shore. Complicating matters was the lingering shadow of her mother. Though they were estranged, Madame Tong was still in Hong Kong, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Every now and then, a tabloid would run a story about her mother being spotted in a cheap gambling den or living in squalor. The guilt would flare up, sharp and hot. The filial daughter programming would kick in, urging her to rush to the rescue. But the new Ada, fortified by her faith and her therapy, stood firm. She learned the hardest lesson of love. Sometimes, the only way to help an addict is to let them hit rock bottom alone. She had to love her mother from a distance, praying for her but refusing to open the wallet. This discipline required a strength far greater than the strength it took to pay the debts. It was the strength of the surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb to save the patient. It hurt, it bled, but it was the only path to survival. As 2001 bled into 2002, Ada Choi was a woman in reconstruction. She was rebuilding her finances from zero, learning the novelty of saving money for herself. She was rebuilding her heart, learning to trust friends who wanted nothing from her. And she was rebuilding her career, looking for a project that would define her second act. She didn't know it yet, but the winds were shifting. The focus of the Asian entertainment world was moving north, towards the vast, untapped market of mainland China. And in that new frontier, a role was waiting. A role that would require every ounce of pain, betrayal, and regal dignity she had accumulated over her tragic youth. The wilderness was ending. The rain was about to begin. By the late 2000s, the tectonic plates of the Asian entertainment industry were shifting. The golden age of Hong Kong cinema and television, which had reigned supreme for decades, was beginning to rust. The energy, the capital, and the audience were migrating north, across the border to mainland China. For many Hong Kong stars, this transition was a graveyard. The cultural differences, the language barrier, and the sheer scale of the Chinese market proved to be insurmountable obstacles. Many kings and queens of the TVB era faded into obscurity, unable to adapt to the new empire. But for Ada Choi, the North represented something else, a blank canvas. It was a place where her past, the debts, the scandal, the mistress label, held less currency. It was a land where she could be judged solely on the merit of her craft. However, the migration was not an immediate triumph. It was a slow, humbling grind. In the mid-2000s, Ada began to take roles in Chinese productions, often finding herself in a strange linguistic purgatory. Her Mandarin was, by her own admission, atrocious. On set, she would speak her lines in Cantonese, while her co-stars responded in Mandarin, creating a disjointed rhythm that required immense concentration to maintain emotional continuity. She was often mocked in the press for her accent, treating her as a relic of a bygone Hong Kong era trying to cash in on the yuan. But Ada possessed a weapon that transcended language, a face that could narrate a tragedy without speaking a word. She had spent a decade masking her pain in real life. Acting was simply the professional application of her survival mechanism. She rebuilt her career brick by brick, not for fame, but for survival. She crossed the border into mainland China, taking roles that mirrored her own trauma. Women who were used, betrayed, and forced to harden their hearts. But this time, the money she earned didn't go into a gambling machine. It went into her own future. The resurrection was complete. Ada Choi had risen from the ashes of her mother's gambling debts and the scandal of her youth. She had crossed the border into a new land and conquered it. But a queen needs a king, not a king who buys her, but a king who serves her. And while her career was reaching its zenith, her personal life was quietly undergoing its own revolution. The story of her resurrection is not complete without the man who stood in the shadows, holding her hand while the world called her a fallen woman. By 2003, Ada Choi had achieved a fragile kind of peace. She had severed the financial gangrene of her mother's debts. She had found a spiritual anchor in her faith, and she had stabilized her career. But in the department of the heart, she remained a fortress, with the drawbridge permanently raised. The trauma of her relationship with Joseph Lau and the subsequent failure of her romance with Nicky Wu had left deep, calcified scars. She had internalized a brutal narrative that she was damaged goods, a woman whose history of being a kept mistress disqualified her from the purity of ordinary love. In the transactional marketplace of Hong Kong high society, she was viewed as a depreciated asset. Beautiful, yes, but carrying too much baggage. The men who approached her were often wealthy types looking for a trophy, men who reminded her of the cage she had just escaped. Ada, however, was no longer interested in golden cages. She had learned the hard way that a man's wallet is often a measure of his power to control, not his capacity to love. It was in this state of romantic cynicism that she arrived in Suzhou, China, to film a wuxia drama titled The Paradise. The production was a typical chaotic affair: dusty sets, long hours, and a cast drawn from across the Chinese diaspora. Among them was a young actor named Zhang Jin. To the Hong Kong press, Zhang Jin was a nobody. He was a mainland boy, with no money, no fame, and seemingly no future. His resume was that of a blue-collar worker in the dream factory. He was a former wushu athlete who had transitioned into stunt work. He had been the stunt double for Zhang Ziyi in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, throwing his body through the air while the stars took the close-ups. In 2003, he was trying to break into acting, but he was still on the fringes, looking in. The contrast between Ada Choi and Zhang Jin could not have been more stark. She was a Hong Kong TV queen, loud, boisterous, surrounded by assistants, and earning a salary that dwarfed his. He was quiet, introverted, a man of few words who spent his breaks practicing martial arts forms in the corner of the studio lot. On paper, they were a mismatch of catastrophic proportions, but fate often operates in the margins. On set, Ada was her usual effervescent self, the life of the party, cracking jokes in her terrible Mandarin to hide the loneliness that gnawed at her during the quiet moments. Zhang Jin watched her. He didn't see the celebrity or the scandal queen. He saw a woman who was trying very hard to be happy. He saw the cracks in the porcelain. The courtship began not with grand gestures, but with silence. Zhang Jin was not a man of poetry. He was a man of action. He began to look out for her in small, practical ways. He noticed when she was cold. He noticed when she was tired. He became a quiet, steady presence in the chaos of the production. He eventually mustered the courage to confess his feelings. Ada rejected him. She didn't reject him because she didn't like him. She rejected him because she was terrified. She told him explicitly and brutally about her past. She laid out the wreckage of her life, the gambling mother, the billionaire tycoon, the debts, the shame. "I am not a good woman," she reportedly told him. "My past is too heavy. You cannot carry it." She was trying to protect him from the toxicity of her own life. She believed that dragging a poor, honest boy into her world of Hong Kong tabloids and complex trauma would destroy him. Zhang Jin was undeterred. He was a martial artist. He understood that pain is part of the process, and that balance is achieved not by avoiding weight, but by learning how to stand under it. He pursued her 3 times. The first 2 times she pushed him away, citing the geographic distance, the economic disparity, and her own emotional bankruptcy. The 3rd time, however, something shifted. Zhang Jin didn't offer to pay her debts. He couldn't afford to. He didn't offer to buy her a house. He lived in a dormitory. He offered something she had never received from any man in her life: unconditional acceptance. He told her that he knew her past, and he simply didn't care. He wasn't looking for a Miss Hong Kong. He was looking for Ada. "I have enough strength to carry your past," he said. It was a promise made not with money, but with muscle and bone. When Ada finally said yes, she was making the biggest gamble of her life. For a woman raised by a gambler, this was a terrifying irony. She was betting her heart on a long shot. She was choosing a man with 0 net worth, but infinite integrity. She was rejecting the iron logic of her mother, that money equals safety, and embracing a terrifying new truth that safety comes from character. If Ada and Max thought their love would be celebrated, they were naive about the cruelty of the Hong Kong media. When the relationship was eventually revealed, the backlash was vitriolic. The tabloids of the mid-2000s were ruthless in their classism. They viewed the union through a lens of sneering elitism. Who was this mainland peasant? Who was this poor stuntman daring to date a Hong Kong goddess? They labeled Jiang Jin a soft rice king. They accused him of using Ada to climb the social ladder. They mocked his clothes, his lack of Cantonese fluency, and his obscurity. Every time they were photographed together, the captions were scathing. Ada Choi pays for dinner. Ada Choi drives the car. Poor boyfriend follows like a puppy. For Jiang Jin, the public emasculation was agonizing. The tabloids labeled him a parasite living off a queen. Yet, unlike the other figures in Ada's life who saw her as a resource to be mined, Max saw her as a woman to be cherished. He absorbed the humiliation without complaint, offering her the one thing her mother never could, a safe harbor where her value wasn't calculated by her bank balance. He didn't try to compete with her fame. He simply stood firm, proving his worth not through wealth, but through an unwavering presence. Ada, for her part, became a lioness. The woman who had once been too ashamed to speak about her boyfriend, Joseph Lau, now defended Jiang Jin with a fierce, vocal pride. She told anyone who would listen that Max was the best thing that ever happened to her. She publicly praised his talent, his kindness, his singing, his martial arts. She was trying to rewrite the narrative, to show the world what she saw, a diamond in the rough. But the most profound aspect of this period was the healing that occurred in private. For the first time, Ada was in a relationship where money was not the currency of affection. With Joseph Lau, every gift had a price tag and a silent obligation. With Jiang Jin, a bowl of noodles at a roadside stall was just a bowl of noodles. There was no debt. There was no leverage. This poverty was liberating. Ada realized that she could be loved even when she wasn't useful. She could be loved without makeup. She could be loved when she was angry or sad or broke. Jiang Jin loved the woman, not the asset. However, the shadow of the power imbalance loomed large. As they moved towards marriage, the disparity in their status became a practical hurdle. Ada was wealthy again. She had rebuilt her fortune. Max was still struggling. The traditional gender roles of Chinese society dictated that the man should provide. Ada had to navigate this minefield with extreme delicacy, ensuring that she didn't wound his pride while they built a life together. They developed a unique dynamic. Ada was the loud one, the public face, the one who handled the press. Max was the quiet anchor, the one who handled the home, the emotions, the stability. It was a partnership of opposites, but the world was still waiting for them to fail. The betting pools in the gossip columns favored a breakup. He will cheat on her once he gets famous, they said. She will get tired of supporting him, they whispered. They didn't understand that Ada Choi and Jiang Jin were not playing by the rules of the Hong Kong celebrity circuit. They were survivors. Ada had survived the debt. Max had survived the physical brutality of the wushu world. They were both accustomed to pain, and they were both stubborn enough to endure it. As 2008 approached, Ada decided to double down on her bet. She didn't just want to date him, she wanted to marry him. She wanted to stand before God and the paparazzi and declare that this poor stuntman was the king of her heart. It was a decision that would lead to one of the most unconventional and controversial open letters in entertainment history. The year 2008 marked the pivotal turning point in Ada Choi's personal narrative, a moment where she chose to rewrite the script that Hong Kong society had handed her. For nearly 2 decades, her romantic life had been defined by transaction and tragedy. First, the coerced contract with a billionaire, then the doomed bond of debt with Nicky Wu. But on January 12, 2008, Ada prepared to make a declaration that would defy the cynical logic of the tabloids. She was going to marry Zhang Jin, the man the press had dismissively labeled a nobody, a poor stuntman, and the soft rice king. Before the wedding, Ada released a handwritten open letter to the media. In an industry dominated by carefully curated PR statements and legal disclaimers, this letter was a shock of raw, unpolished emotion. It was raw and unfiltered, filled with biblical references and a defiant joy. "He is a handsome man," she wrote, describing her fiancé. "He is the best of the best." To the cynical editors in the newsrooms, this read like the delusions of a woman blinding herself to reality. To them, the math simply didn't add up. Ada was a millionaire television queen. Max was a background actor earning a pittance. In Hong Kong's materialist ecosystem, this was a merger destined for bankruptcy. The wedding itself was a study in contrast to the opulent, suffocating events of her youth. There was no grand ballroom at the Regent Hotel. There were no diamond necklaces gifted by tycoons. The ceremony took place at the Hong Kong Baptist Theological Seminary Chapel. It was modest, intimate, and sacred. However, the weather that day seemed to conspire with the skeptics. It poured with rain. The skies over Hong Kong opened up in a torrential downpour, a gray, ominous backdrop for a celebration. But as Ada stepped out of the car, shielded by umbrellas, she was beaming. She wasn't wearing a dress bought with dirty money. She was walking towards a man who loved her poverty as much as her wealth. When they exchanged vows, Ada wept. These were not the tears of the 2000 press conference, tears of exhaustion and shame. These were tears of liberation. She was finally breaking the curse of the golden cage. She was pledging her life to a man who offered her nothing but his name and his hands. But outside the chapel walls, the narrative remained vicious. The headlines the next day were predictable. Princess Mary's pauper. How long will it last? The paparazzi zoomed in on the cheapness of the decorations, the simplicity of the ring. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse, placing bets on when Max's ego would crumble under the weight of his wife's fame. The years following the wedding were a crucible for Zhang Jin. While Ada experienced a career renaissance with her work in mainland China, culminating in the explosive success of Empresses in the Palace, Max remained stuck in the shadows. He was effectively Mr. Ada Choi. When he walked red carpets with her, photographers would shout at him to step aside so they could get a solo shot of his wife. When he gave interviews, the questions were never about his craft. They were always about her schedule, her money, her life. For a traditional Chinese man, raised on the values of providing and protecting, this public emasculation was a psychological torture. He was working constantly, taking roles as a stunt coordinator, a body double, a minor villain, but the breakthrough refused to come. He was trapped in the intermediate state of the industry, too talented to be an extra, but not famous enough to be a lead. The tension in the household could have been toxic. It is the classic recipe for divorce, the wife earning 10 times the husband's salary, the world mocking the husband's inadequacy. But this is where the character of the couple shone through. Ada Choi, the loud, boisterous diva, became a master of quiet diplomacy at home. She never pressured him to make money. She never complained about his lack of status. Instead, she became his hype man. She constantly told him, "You are a star. The world just hasn't woken up yet." She saw the diamond when everyone else saw a rock. And Zhang Jin? He didn't turn to alcohol. He didn't turn to other women to soothe his bruised ego. He turned to the gym. He turned to the dojo. He channeled his frustration into a monastic discipline. He refined his martial arts, pushing his body to the breaking point. He studied acting, determined to prove that he was not just a pair of fists, but an artist. He waited. He sharpened his blade in the dark, preparing for a war that only he knew was coming. Max offered her something she had never known, a relationship without a price tag. He didn't care about her debts or her scandal. For the first time, Ada was loved not for what she could pay, but for who she was. He became the quiet anchor that prevented her from drifting back into the chaos of her past. But significantly, the dynamic between them didn't change. Ada remained the loud, chaotic, affectionate fangirl. Max remained the quiet, stoic anchor. They had survived the poverty of the early years, and now they were surviving the success. For Ada, this was the final piece of her healing. She had spent her youth being sold by family members who viewed her as a commodity. Now she was married to a man who had refused to use her fame for a shortcut, who had fought for 6 years in the mud to stand beside her as an equal. She had found a love that was not transactional. The phoenix had risen from the ashes of her mother's debts. The warrior had fought his way out of the shadows. And now, standing together on the stage of their lives, they were no longer victims of their pasts. They were the architects of a new legacy, one built not on gambling chips or billionaire contracts, but on the stubborn, unyielding belief that two broken people can build a whole world together. However, the most complex chapter of Ada's motherhood is not about the children she bore, but the mother she bore. After the nuclear explosion of the year 2000 press conference and the subsequent years of estrangement, Madame Tong did not vanish from the earth. She remained a ghost haunting the periphery of Ada's life. For years, the silence was absolute. But time is a relentless eroder of stone. As Madame Tong aged, the fire of her gambling addiction began to dim, not necessarily because she found virtue, but perhaps because she simply ran out of energy. The Iron Lady was becoming a frail old woman. Ada faced a dilemma that defines the moral complexity of the survivor. Should she leave her mother to rot? Justice would say yes. The woman had sold her daughter, stolen her youth, and driven her to the brink of suicide. No jury in the world would convict Ada for abandoning her. But Ada Choi is a Christian, and the central tenet of her faith is grace, the giving of favor to those who do not deserve it. Slowly, quietly, without press conferences or fanfare, Ada began to open the door. It was not a restoration of the old dynamic. The bank vault remained locked. Ada made it clear, I will feed you, I will house you, I will care for your body, but I will never again pay your gambling debts. It was a truce drawn on Ada's terms. The power dynamic had flipped. The daughter was now the matriarch, and the mother was the dependent. The paparazzi began to capture images that confused the public. Ada Choi and Madame Tong having tea. Ada walking with her mother to church. They weren't hugging with the warmth of a Hallmark movie. There was a stiffness, a distance, the visible scar tissue of a wound that had closed but never fully healed. But they were there, together. The most poignant vindication came when Madame Tong became a grandmother. The woman who had once viewed children as assets was now seen holding Ada's daughters, playing the role of the benign elder. Did she regret her past? We do not know. Madame Tong has never given a confessional interview. But Ada allowed her access to the grandchildren, granting her mother a chance to experience a pure relationship that she had denied her own daughter. This act of inclusion is perhaps Ada's greatest strength. It is easy to cut people off. It is infinitely harder to keep them in your life while maintaining boundaries of steel. Ada chose the harder path. She chose to honor the commandment, honor thy father and mother. But she added her own crucial footnote, honor them, but do not let them destroy you. In recent years, Ada has spoken more openly about the physical pain she endures daily. The AS flares up when the weather changes, when she works too hard, when she holds her son for too long. But she refuses to take strong painkillers that might cloud her mind or affect her ability to be present for her family. There is a poetic, if cruel, symmetry to this. For the first half of her life, her pain was emotional and external, inflicted by debt, by shame, by the judgments of Hong Kong society. In the second half, the pain is internal and physical, locked in her very bones. But Ada views this physical pain differently. It is not a punishment. It is a reminder of her humanity. It keeps her grounded. When she wakes up stiff and aching, she is reminded that she is alive, that she has a body that has survived starvation, exhaustion, and childbirth. The cycle breaker has paid a heavy toll. Her back is stiff, but her head is high. She has built a fortress around her family, not with money, though she has plenty now, but with the fierce, protective love of a woman who knows exactly what happens when the wolves are let in. She has ensured that her daughter Zoe will never know the inside of a VIP casino room. She has ensured that her son Josiah will never have to sign a loan shark's paper to save his mother. The debt stops here. The trauma stops here. By the mid-2000s, Ada Choi has transitioned from a tragic heroine to a triumphant matriarch. But the story isn't just about survival. It's about the quality of the life she fought to save. What does it mean to be happy when you carry the scars of a war that lasted 20 years? The answer lies in the final chapter, a reflection on legacy, aging, and the redefinition of beauty. The panorama of Ada Choi's life in the mid-2000s does not present the pristine, airbrushed ending of a fairy tale. Instead, it reveals something far more compelling: the rugged, enduring architecture of a survivor. Born in 1973, Ada is now in her 50s. In an industry that treats aging like a terminal illness, often discarding women the moment their collagen begins to fade, Ada Choi remains a vital, thundering force. She appears on reality shows across China, her signature cackle, a loud, uninhibited sound that seems to originate from her gut, echoing through millions of television sets. She is chaotic, she is funny, and she is unabashedly loud. But to look at her now, laughing as she struggles to cook a meal or bickering playfully with her husband Max Zhang, is to witness a miracle of resilience. This woman, who stands so solidly on the ground of her own life, is the same person who stood on the precipice of the Regent Hotel ballroom in 1991, sold into a gilded slavery. She is the same person who stood before a press corps in 2000, weeping as she severed the artery of her family. She is the same person who walked through the valley of the shadow of debt, carrying a burden of 100 million Hong Kong dollars. How did she survive? In the pantheon of Hong Kong's tragic beauties, stars like Yami Lam, whose life ended in madness and destitution, or Anita, who fought lonely battles until the end, Ada Choi stands as an outlier. She walked into the fire, but she did not burn. She emerged not as ash, but as steel. Ada Choi never tried to hide the cracks in her life. In a culture that prioritizes saving face above all else, where families bury their secrets in deep graves of silence, she did the unthinkable. She displayed her scars. She took the ugly, jagged shards of her history, the mistress, the unfilial daughter, the debt slave, and reassembled them into a mosaic of redemption. When young actresses in China or Hong Kong look at Ada today, they don't just see a celebrity. They see a roadmap out of hell. She represents the possibility that your origin story does not dictate your ending. You can be born into a toxic family. You can be exploited. You can be slandered by the press, and you can still, through sheer force of will and grace, build a kingdom of peace. She survived the brutal transactional nature of her youth, not by becoming colder, but by becoming warmer. She defeated the greed that destroyed her family by choosing a non-transactional love. Her marriage to Max Zhang is the ultimate monument to this shift. In the 1990s, success for a woman like Ada was defined by marrying a tycoon, finding a Joseph Lau to pay the bills. In the 2000s, Ada redefined success as marrying a partner, finding a Zhang Jian to share the burden. She chose the poor stuntman over the billionaires. And in doing so, she proved that security does not come from a bank account. It comes from a spine. Max didn't save her from her debts. She saved herself from the debts. Max saved her from the loneliness of the victory. Perhaps the most challenging and controversial aspect of her legacy is her relationship with her mother. Critics might argue that Ada should have walked away and never looked back. Justice would dictate that Madame Tong deserved a lonely old age, but Ada's life challenges us to look beyond the binary of victim and villain. By allowing her mother back into her life, albeit with strict boundaries, Ada demonstrated a strength far greater than vengeance. Vengeance is easy. It is a reaction. Forgiveness is hard. It is a creation. By forgiving the Iron Lady, Ada freed herself from the chain of hatred. If she had lived her life in anger, she would still be Madame Tong's prisoner, just in a different prison cell. By forgiving, she evicted the ghost. She looked at the monster who sold her and saw only a frail, flawed human being. This act of grace is not weakness. It is the ultimate power move. It says, "You tried to destroy me, but I am so abundant in spirit that I can afford to feed you." The final accounting of the $100 million debt reveals a different truth. For 10 years, that number defined her. It was the price tag on her head. It was the weight that crushed her posture. But looking back from the vantage point of 2026, we can reframe that debt. It was the tuition fee for a master class in life. Because she lost everything, she learned that she needed nothing. Because she was judged, she learned not to judge. Because she was sold, she learned the true value of freedom. The $100 million purchased her wisdom. It burned away the superficiality of celebrity, leaving behind a woman who knows exactly who she is. When she walks the red carpet now, wearing diamonds that she bought with her own money, there is a heaviness to her step that commands respect. She is not floating on the bubble of fame. She is walking on the solid ground of survival. In her most famous role as the Empress and Empresses in the Palace, her character dies alone, broken, consumed by her own venom. The tragedy of the Empress was that she could not let go of her need for control and power. Ada Choi is the anti-Empress. She won by letting go. She let go of the need to be perfect. She let go of the need to please the press. She let go of the need to save her mother. And in that surrender, she found her victory. She is now the matriarch of her own clan, the Choi dynasty. But this is not a dynasty built on blood money or triad connections. It is a dynasty built on Sunday school lessons, family dinners, bad jokes, and the fierce protection of privacy. Her children, Zoe, Chloe, and Josiah, are the first generation of her line to grow up without the shadow of the loan shark. They are the first to know that their mother's love is free. Imagine a quiet Sunday afternoon in Hong Kong. The humidity is high. The air smells of salt and exhaust fumes, the smell of home. Ada Choi is sitting on a balcony, looking out over the harbor. Her back aches. The ankylosing spondylitis is a constant humming reminder of her mortality. She shifts in her chair, wincing slightly. Inside the apartment, there is the sound of chaos. Her son is running around with a toy sword, mimicking his father. Her daughters are arguing over a video game. Max is in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with the rhythmic precision of a martial artist. Ada takes a sip of tea. She picks up her phone and sees a notification. A tabloid has run a flashback article. The Secret History of Ada Choi's Lost Years. They have dug up the old photos from the Regent Hotel, the 18-year-old girl with the terrified eyes and the forced smile. Ada looks at the photo. She doesn't scroll past it quickly in shame. She looks at that girl. She looks at the ghost of her former self, and then she smiles. Not a camera-ready smile, but a small, private smile of recognition. She whispers to the girl on the screen, "You made it. It cost everything, but you made it." She puts the phone down, turning the screen black. The past is there, preserved in the digital amber of the internet, but it can no longer hurt her. She stands up, fighting the stiffness in her spine, and walks back inside, toward the noise, toward the mess, toward the life that she bought, paid for, and owns completely. The debt is cleared. The account is closed. The scarred beauty has finally come home.